I had this Alan Watts quote floating around in my head for years, and I can't get rid of it. It says, if we are unduly absorbed in improving our lives, we may forget altogether how to live them.
Yes.
And that process of being and becoming, the balance between being tough enough on yourself to motivate further action and delicate and compassionate enough on yourself to be able to have gratitude for the things that you have done. This to me seems like being comfortable with our sense of lacking wisdom for people who desire wisdom seems to be one of the most difficult things to bear, because it's both the poison and the tonic.
Yeah. Well, pharmacy, medicine means both poison and medicine, the Greek word. It means both. And Socrates talks about this in the Symposium, right? We are never wise. We are always lovers of wisdom. If someone says they're wise to you, that's often very good evidence that they aren't. So when you love something, love is this weird thing. Like, love is to recognize a lack, but also it starts to shape you in your seeking. And part of the trick of love, I think, is taking that lack and taking that gap, that hole, that opening, that vulnerability, and shaping it into receptivity, shaping it into sensitivity. Because you're never going to grasp wisdom, but you can progressively learn how to reshape your lack into a sensitive space that's better and better at receiving it. And so I think that the task of being a good philosopher, a lover of wisdom, is exactly to go through that transformation. And I think that's consonant with many of the ways we have to learn how to love. The difficult thing, and I find it personally difficult, I'm not speaking as somebody who's on the other side of this mountain. I'm still very much slogging in the foothills trying to make my way up. But getting from, love as not sort of trying to hold on, but hold up, right? And so that you can get into this reciprocal opening with something or someone. I think that's a big part of this. But that's what I was meaning when I was talking about an optimal grip. This is a term from Merleau-Ponty. Like when you don't think of yourself when you're observing. Let's just do visual perception. You're not static. You move around. So what you do is you move closer to the object if you want more detail. You move farther out if you want the bigger picture. And there's no perfect place to be because you're constantly adjusting that according to, the needs that you have that are changing and the environment that is constantly changing. In a similar way, if you'll allow me a bit of a stretch, you have to get an optimal grip on yourself, and you have to get an optimal grip on your lack of wisdom so that you come, in some sense, to start to know yourself in the shaping of your love for wisdom.
Is that why you've got your tattoo?
Yeah. This one, you mean Know Thyself? Yeah. Yeah, the one on my back is because I want Socrates constantly behind me. Yeah. I mean, I keep coming back to that again and again and again. And how often, and I'm going through something around this right now, where I've found ways in which, unbeknownst to me, I have been inertial. I have not been knowing myself so that I can open up properly to the world. And so that keeps coming. And the Socratic sense of this, right? Know thyself isn't to recount your autobiography. We're all wonderful at that. And we glory in it. And how unique my autobiography is and all that largely bullshitty thing we do. But more really, it's almost like I say, it's not an autobiography. I sometimes say it's more like an operating manual. Like, how do I function? How do I work? How am I stuck? How am I ignorant? And even more important, can I get some sense, often with the help of others, of how I'm self-deceptive? That's what it means to know yourself from the Socratic point of view.
If you were to write an IKEA manual, you've just mentioned the operating schedule there. And my first ever brief for the website that came attached with this podcast 3 years ago was life doesn't come with an operating manual. Yeah. If you were to do that IKEA put it together book, what would the broad chapters be? What would it look like?
The broad chapters would be learning about the different ways in which we learn, the different ways we know. I mentioned the perspectival and the participatory, like the procedural and the propositional as well. So learning the ways in which we are intelligent learners, and then learning the ways in which the very use of that intelligence makes us vulnerable to self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And then learning how to cultivate an ecology of practices, multi-level, recursive self-organization, checks and balancing, an ecology of practices that can ameliorate the really, really complicated and often screwed up dynamical systems that we become. And then paying attention to the dimensionality of that this is not just a cognitive task. You're not just coming into a cognitive maturity. This is also, and these are interwoven. We've separated them in our culture, but they're not separated in our brain. The way our, emotional maturity, what does cognitive maturity look like? What is emotional maturity? How do those two forms of maturity bump up against each other? How do they afford each other? How do they support each other? How do they interfere with each other? And also existential maturity, which has to do with, what kind of, I hesitate to use this, but what kind of self do you have? We're talking about know thyself. What kind of self do you have? What kind of roles is it capable of? How well coordinated are those roles? How much do they conflict with each other? How are you getting an optimal grip between, this is from Vellman, being sort of like what he calls a wanton behavior, where you're just acting on impulse, or you're so up here, you're Hamlet, and you're reflecting yourself to death, and everybody's dying around you. What kind of, are you in between? Is yourself getting you in between those two? Is it helping you aspire to a better future self? Is it, like I said, allowing you to assume the roles that allow you not only to function in a socially or even morally acceptable way, but in a way that affords the making of meaning, the making of those real connections? So, yeah, I think those are the things I put in as the chapters.
I reckon you could construct a fairly good human from that. I reckon you could.